if there's ever a conspiracy theory that'll get you, this one is one that makes you scratch your head. 2 cameras broken, 2 guards sleeping at the same time. They hadn't made their mandatory 30-minute rounds in the past 3 hours. Like you mentioned, a roommate that had been transferred away several days beforehand. He'd been taken off suicide watch despite the fact that less than 2 weeks beforehand, he'd been found semi-conscious with marks on his neck in his own cell. You mentioned he's one of the highest profile prisoners, even with the history of the Bureau of Prisons, meaning that they're overworked and understaffed, that there's corruption, that they haven't implemented reform. It seems to me that there are an awful lot of questions that still need to be asked, and this stuff from the autopsy, from this doctor who was hired by Mark Epstein, who's Jeffrey Epstein's brother, just raises more questions. The hemorrhages in his eyes as well. Talk to me about the forensic aspect of that.
Sure. Well, petechial hemorrhaging occurs, and those are the broken blood vessels in the eye and sometimes around the mouth. Those take place classically in strangulations, but to be quite honest, they're also present in hanging. I've seen a number of them, but I would go a little bit deeper into the pathology here, and I would make sure that when the autopsy is re-reviewed, they did a radiology on the bones, and they also did a histology, which is a cell structure examination to make sure that the injuries were ante-mortem. Okay, so in other words, before he actually died, what was the mechanism of injury that killed him? You know, classically, my understanding and the way he was found was a suspension hanging. In other words, a ligature, he placed a ligature allegedly around his neck and then leaned forward. So this wasn't a jump hanging. A jump hanging, we would see cervical fractures, and we would see some fractures around the cricoid cartilage, cricoid and hyoid bone, but not necessarily from a suspension hanging. Okay, so remember, when the person suspends themselves, they cut off the oxygenated blood to the brain, which becomes hypoxic, and then they pass out. They can pass out in as early as 15 seconds. And then the body leans forward, which places more pressure, but not necessarily sufficient pressure to fracture all 3 of those bones. So that's where I find myself in agreement with Dr. Bodden. Somewhat rare.